Okay, well, thank you so much for this, for having me and Janaina Pinto. Janaina is an independent researcher and she's my research assistant in this research project, which has just begun. We started in January this year. As a matter of fact, it's totally a result from being part of CSSN, directly stemming from this invitation coming from Timmons and the work in the coordination of the working group with Ruth, right? I have been doing research on international development cooperation politics, human rights politics, a little bit on climate change, international politics too. And then I come from a background of political science and international relations. And I say this because I think that these disciplinary, interdisciplinary perspectives are important for you to understand where we speak from. And also speaking from, I mean, another place of where from I speak is, of course, being situated in Rio under the Bolsonaro administration, which you can imagine what it all means in terms of boosting denialisms and many types of obstruction politics, including the pro-climate agenda. I'd like to thank Janaina for being here with us too. She preferred that I speak. I wanted her to speak to get some practice, but she was a little bit nervous, and then she will come into talking with us during the debate. I would rather have this conversation with you in Barcelona personally, to be able to walk around the Palau de la Música and things like that. But unfortunately, we have to do this virtually. I know that it's better for the emissions, but well, I miss Barcelona a lot. And the project is entitled Climate Change, Denial and Politics of Obstruction in Brazil. And this presentation, this paper, which we are writing together, Janaina and I, is part of an ongoing research project whose main goal is to map the main actors in Brazilian climate change politics of obstruction, including people, individuals, leaders of these narratives, organizations and networks. We want to understand and describe and analyze their narratives, their ways and means, who funds them, where do they get their funding from, what their articulations with the current administration in Brazil are, as well as the international and transnational organizations that work and have been working in the past 10 years at least in support of their local action. In terms of methodology, we are taking politics of obstruction, denial, and delay as native categories and approaching our interviewees in this first phase of the project. We have already interviewed 15 individuals. They all come from the pro-climate political field. They are either scholars, they are civil society actors, or they just call themselves sometimes leaders, because they are neither scholars nor members of the any civil society organization, and then they prefer to call themselves just leaders. For example, the former Minister of Environment, Isabella Teixeira, whom we also have interviewed. And these virtual interviews focused, of course, we have a roadmap for the interviews, a kind of a guide, which I can also share with you, but it's too long. It's 5 or 6 pages. But the interviews, they want to scan the interviewees' perspectives and perceptions on this political field in Brazil. Be these organizations and actors religious, economic operators, from the mass media, from the social media, because there are some bloggers, for example, or academic social groups, which may be also working together in favor of denial, obstruction, and delay. And the interviews are focused on their narratives, their modalities of action, funding, access to the legislative and executive branches of the federal government, as well as transnational networks. But for the time being, we are basing our description and analysis exclusively on the perception of our interviewees. We have not yet, this is going to be at the end of my presentation, engaged with the actors themselves, right? Also, as part of this first phase of our research project, we have reviewed secondary data available on denial and politics of obstruction in Brazil, and identified traditional and social sources. By traditional, I mean research papers, papers published in journals and things like that. And there are, just to make it very schematic in my presentation, two types of bibliography that we have met. The first one is critical analysis or just analysis of denial and obstruction in Brazil. There is no literature on obstruction in Brazil, right? The literature that we have found is totally anchored and this terminology of denialism. And that's the example, I mean, one of the main examples, the work being done by Deborah Danowski from the Pontifical Catholic University here in Rio. And in our preliminary analysis of scholarly work, we can find 16 pieces, very general pieces, sometimes 5-page leaflet or 20-page book, which is an online book or something like this. And they include the following dimensions: philosophical and psychological motivations behind denialism in general, not only concerning climate change, but also historical denial, denial of human rights, denial of the relevance of indigenous peoples in the construction of the Brazilian society, denialism of discrimination and prejudice against, and racism against different sorts of populations in Brazil. They also include another dimension, which is the Brazilian ultra-right actors and their relationship with climate change denial. In the field of political analysis and political sciences, we can find some scholars who have been studying the Bolsonaro administration and how Bolsonaro got elected. And within this kind of literature, which is much broader than specifically dealing with denial, we can find some mentions, some insights on the role of some ultra-conservative movements and religious movements in denying and in partnering with Bolsonaro's election and currently his administration. Also, some analysis on manifestations of climate denial on the internet, the consequences of climate change denial on climate governance in Brazil, and on the dismantling of environmental and climate agenda in Brazil, not only the legislations and the regulations, but also the whole agenda in terms of diplomacy, foreign policy, in terms of political institutions' capabilities of control and monitoring, both the environmental, the broad environmental agenda, and the specific climate agenda. And some analysis on the chronology of the public expression of Brazilian climate denial. Another kind of bibliography that we have encountered during this research is the bibliography actually published or translated and disseminated by denial groups themselves, right? And of course, I mean, this book, Psicose Ambientalista, which I would translate as environmentalist psychosis, I don't know how to translate that, or The Ecological Empire, which is a translation of a book written by Pascal Cardin and highly disseminated in Brazil by Ricardo Felício, who is professor at USP, but also he was a candidate under the same political party of Jair Bolsonaro in the elections of 2018. He wanted to be a federal deputy. And luckily, he was not elected, but he's very popular in these denial networks in Brazil. He's one of the main disseminators of denialism against climate change in Brazil. And these papers and books, if you want to call them like this, they are discussing non-anthropogenic theories for global warming. Then there is a kind of a literal denial of anthropogenic climate change that we can find in these narratives, political ties behind the global warming consensus, of course, dialoguing directly with conspiracy theories, and the denunciation of what many of these players have called here in Brazil globalism and cultural Marxism as ways and means used by pro-climate thinkers to disseminate what denialists call this environmental empire, and also denial of carbon dioxide as a pollutant. This specific bibliography on coming from the denial movement itself, there is no academic book, and there are lots of pieces of information on research, leaflets, papers, but so far, none of these Brazilian pieces denying climate change has been published in journals, hard or social sciences included, right? All of them can be found on the internet. All of them can be found on many blogs and things like that, but they have not been published on peer-reviewed journals or pieces like that. I have introduced this academic, quote unquote, field of denial and this academic perspective on denial because, as you can see, it's very few. There's not lots of research, which gives me lots of legitimacy to engage with the object, of course. And then, of course, I'm happy because I'm not inaugurating, but I think I am able to give some food for thought in the analysis of denial, obstruction, and delay in Brazil. But in spite of this very few analyses that have been published, from by the denial movement itself or on denial by critical scholars, the current political context shows how governments matter to boost the very few pieces of research into climate obstruction. As I have said, I mean, the dismantling of the climate agenda is extremely accelerating in Brazil. And according to our interviewees, there are many types of climate obstructors in Brazil, and scholars are not the main actors, right? As you can see, I have shown here some pictures of perhaps the main actors. I know that in this room there are no haters, then I can even say their names. And this is our president, of course, and the Minister of Environment, Ricardo Salles, and our former chancellor, as we call them here in Brazil, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Itamaraty Minister, Ernesto Araújo, who is not anymore minister since last April, right? But he was one of the main ideological thinkers, and he's still part of the movement, although he's not a minister anymore. And he has just given his testimony in the current investigation commission in the Senate in Brasilia. And he denied many things, not concerning climate change, but concerning the current COVID-19 pandemic and the role he has had as a denialer of the role of vaccines, calling, for example, the vaccine coming from China as the Vachina and not vaccine, but making a play of words between in Portuguese between China and the vaccine from China, and denying the effectiveness of vaccines here in the management of the pandemic in Brazil. These 15 interviews have allowed us, so far, we still have 5 interviews to conclude this first phase of the project, to identify 2 main profiles which can be highlighted. Actors committed to economic sectors, for which advancing the climate agenda poses serious problems to their own immediate interests. And of course, the agribusiness sector is perhaps the main sector that sustains lots of leaders and organizations locally in the broader field of obstruction in Brazil, and actors committed to a political ideology that associates climate denial and many other ultra-conservative agendas, be it in the field of gender, human rights, rights of indigenous peoples, LGBTI+ populations' rights, and so on and so forth. This is a first map that we have so far been able to build. It's very preliminary. It's the first time that I present this publicly. And you can see different categories of actors, individuals, organizations, economic groups. You can find PhDs, you can find bloggers, you can find federal deputies, you can find religious leaders, you can find university people, scholars, and so on and so forth. Our aim, all these names and all these institutions and all these organizations and networks, they have popped up and they have been cited by our interviewees, right? And all this material comes from the interviews directly. What we are going to do next is to categorize these individual actors, be them persons or organizations and networks, and associate narratives to each of them, right? To make this mapping a little bit more understandable, because you just have names and you don't have hierarchies, you don't have asymmetries, you don't have relevance and anything like that in this first mapping that we organized for this presentation. This other one gives you a kind of a zoom on domestic media, people, individuals coming from the domestic media or media, just like O Antagonista, which is a blog which conveys and disseminates lots of denial, delay against climate here in Brazil. You have international actors, of course, the Koch brothers, they're always there. Breitbart News, Steve Bannon, of course, and other domestic actors which are not working on the media. But you have actors like Felipe Martins, who is a special counselor on international affairs to the President of the Republic. He was very recently, a month ago, withdrawn from the presidency of the Republic because some news leaked, and then and there's a whole story about this, the reasons why he had to be put away from the presidency of the Republic. I'm not going to get into the detail, I've got no time for that, but he's still working for the government. Right? And you have many names like Alan Santos, who is a blogger, as I said, Ernesto Araújo. You have a former prince from the Brazilian monarchy and monarchic movement, Bertrand d'Orléans et Bragança, as you can see at top left. The whole Bolsonaro family, right? You have institutes and things like the Fórum da Liberdade, just for you to have an idea. The Instituto Millennium, and many others, and some new ones which are being created, right, and which we are mapping as part of this research. I have started saying when I mentioned this this presentation that we want to build empirically this research, taking obstruction, denial, and delay as native categories, so that we can also contribute with some building of conceptual blocks. And based on our context in Brazil, how can we also contribute to theory development and conceptual development in the field of denial and obstruction? A kind of a grounded theory, of course. And what this last slide, it's one before the last slide, shows is some very preliminary hypotheses that we would like to discuss with you. The first one has to do with, and it dialogues a lot with Dieter's presentation today. Denial, delay, and obstruction politics must be understood as a political field, perhaps as a political continuum between literal denial and conception of development models, as we see it here in the Brazilian case, wherein narratives and practices are embedded in local reality. Perhaps we could start talking about varieties of denial, delay, and obstruction. I know, and I understand, and I agree with Ruth that there are superstructural variables that intervene in this local reality and in the capabilities of local actors to have agency. And that's why, of course, transnational forces play a role in terms of funding, in terms of networking, human resources. For example, denial American scientists have been brought to talk to the agribusiness sector here in Brazil on many occasions, right? Organized conferences, things like that. But these transnational forces have to adapt to the local context with lots of imagination and creativity, and they are doing that, right? In Brazil, aside from the fossil lobby, agribusiness, mineral extraction, and ultra-conservative Christians also play, and I say Christians because this includes both ultra-Orthodox Catholics and the neo-Pentecostal churches, which correspond to roughly 22–23% of the electorate in Brazil. That's why, I mean, these constituencies matter a lot when it comes to presidential elections. They also play a pivotal role in delay and obstruction. Climate change, we believe that climate change must be seen as an idea. It's not as so much about the discussion on science. Of course, it includes science, but it includes the visions and the worldviews on environment, on gender. It relates a lot with human rights and the role and rights of indigenous peoples. And the denial movement in Brazil seems to be engaging with climate change as an idea that they have to counter, of course. And the main goal is to avoid and delay debates on the development model and on development politics in Brazil. Of course, they have lots of legitimacy due to the failure of economic models, more or less associated with neoliberalism. And neoliberalism here, I use the conceptual framework developed by Wendy Brown from UC Berkeley, who says that neoliberalism is not only about macroeconomics, it's also a moral and a political reason. And I think that this is extremely important to understand how denial, delay, obstruction actors engage with climate change as an idea. Of course, geopolitically, this is not on the slide, but geopolitically, you cannot forget that denial, obstruction, it has to live with another Brazil since 2008, when the discovery of the oil pre-salt platforms have been announced. And of course, this has contaminated even more the definitions of development in Brazil, both right and left. And with the expansion of the pre-salt and the dismantling of Petrobras's roles in managing and monitoring pre-salt in Brazil, and the arrival of many transnational oil companies, I mean, many of them, not only from China, the US, the UK, and but also from Norway, et cetera, shows how perhaps the fossil fuel has also been boosted in terms of their interests to dialogue with denial movements in Brazil. What are our next steps? We are going to continue to finish these interviews with the field of environment leaders and organizations and scholars very, very soon. We still have 5 interviews to conduct. And the second phase then will be to conduct a series of interviews with diplomats, with climate scientists and religious leaders in Brazil. In partnership with the Observatory of the Brazilian Legislative Branch, we are going to analyze, which is also a research group within the institute where I work in the Rio de Janeiro State University. We are going to analyze voting behavior of legislators in climate-related agendas. And all this before we eventually attempt, and we have been thinking and about how to do this, direct investigation with climate denial leaders and organizations. I thank you so much for your attention. And I'll be very happy to welcome your questions and comments.
Okay. First of all, just a little introduction. My name is Éberson Polita. I thank you, the organizers here, for this event. I have a bachelor's degree in international relations, and I've just finished my master's in international strategic studies. I'm not really a researcher on environmental questions. I usually study security-related topics, but the environmental questions are very dear to me because I got in international relations because of these themes. Lucas?
Okay, I graduated in journalism at University of Caxias do Sul and did my master's degree in international strategic studies at University of Rio Grande do Sul, like Éberson. I researched at Atlas Network in my master's degree. That is in part the object of the study that we will present today. I am researching connections between Atlas think tanks and climate questions in Brazil and with government as well. Now I am PhD student of political science at Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul.
So we start our agenda here. It's very much a work in progress still, but we are quite advanced already. We mainly are working with documents, tracing actors through think tanks and their concepts on environment, their opinion. We're working as well with network analysis. It's still a bit of work in progress. But mainly we start this project because, again, Lucas is studied think tanks already from his master's, and during his research we could see how these think tanks, the think tanks, the right think tanks connected to the Atlas network helped build the path for Bolsonaro. And now that they got a guide up there, let's say, put it that way, how are they acting? How are they building consensus? And we look especially for the environmental questions to see how they are working together, together with the government. But we have a question. Our main objective is to map and systematize concepts on discourse and action and practice from both these think tanks as well as the actors connected to them, which are in the government. Basically, Lucas will explain a little bit better with the theory, but we believe they are think tanks act in the reproduction of ideas, and they continue to do so before the election, and right now they continue to support the president in many ways, or at least the environmental agenda that we deal here. And Lucas will explain a little bit more now about the theory.
Okay, we are working with an instrumental view and a conceptual view in a complementary way in terms of theory. In this sense, we apply the theoretical framework of Thomas Medved's to help the understanding about how these think tanks relate between themselves and how these think tanks relate with other power fields, considering that think tanks compose its own power field. From advocacy, we understand think tanks as actors that circulate in the various fields of power, like political and economic fields or academic field. As think tanks circulate in various fields, they establish a relationship of dependence with other fields at the same time that they maintain an apparent, but just apparent, independence. This kind of ambiguity is in whole Medved's theory, including the concept of think tank as a fuzzy and undefined concept. In this way, think tanks can be lobby companies, but they can be intellectual shelters too. So in general way, we use Medveds to understand how think tanks behave and how think tanks act. On the other hand, we work with Gramsci to understand the direction of neoliberal think tanks in Brazil. From Gramsci, it's possible to understand think tanks as private hegemonic apparatuses, thinking hegemony as the combination and equilibrium of coercion and consensus. Without coercion overlaps consensus. In this sense, think tanks are private hegemonic apparatus that work to shape the public opinion, the state consensus, and to dispute the hegemony of an range of ideas. So we apply Gramsci concepts to understand the direction and the role of these think tanks in Brazil. If from advocacy we understand that think tanks transit in various fields, in a Gramscian thought, we understand that these actors transit in these spaces as private hegemonic apparatuses to build consensus. Next slide, please, Éberson. So we work at imitating the empirical research on Atlas Network think tanks and selecting some think tanks that seem to be more active in climate agenda. However, it's not the main agenda of these actors. We searched some keywords relating with Atlas think tanks like climate change, climate, environment, and sustainability on websites and social media of these think tanks. Next slide. Well, we can identify common elements of these think tanks on environmental agenda. All of them work with the ideas and actions that involve necessarily the free market as a central question. Additionally, they have direct or indirect ties with Bolsonaro government. For example, the Minister of Environment, Ricardo Salles, is one of the founders of the movement in Direita Brasil, which is tied with Instituto Millennium. Paulo Guedes, the Minister of Economy, is one of the founders of the Instituto Millennium. And the Vice President, Hamilton Mourão, participated of Instituto de Estudos Empresariais events frequently. Besides the direct relationship that think tanks establish with the government, they are related indirectly through ideas. It's possible to understand these think tanks that I mentioned on the slide from Medved's dichotomy. While some want to change the policies established in direct relations with governments, others work mainly on intellectual debates. In this sense, there's a distinction between practice and ideas because they are in different fields. In this sense, while some are defending environmental regulation as a barrier for agribusiness, like Instituto Mackenzie, others are promoting the idea of environmental preservation policies like part of a great reset or a global technocracy as a way to control the people and to establish a communist dictatorship. Next slide, please. Here there are the main ideas or concepts that we could map in think tanks publications. About the green anarcho-capitalism, there are a book published by Marco Battaglia, an ecology professor of Federal University of São Carlos. The title of the book is The Libertarian Ambientalist, an Anarcho-Capitalist View of Environmental Preservation. Basically, he tries to relate environmental concepts with Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises theories. For him, the solution is the total privatization of the environment. This idea is not so popular. This kind of debate is restricted by people that do part of the neoliberal network. But Hélio Beltrão, the president of the Instituto Mises, that writes for Folha de São Paulo, one of the most read newspapers in Brazil, adopt this concept, for example. And about the eco-modernism, the main defensor of this idea in Brazilian Atlas family is Leandro Narlock. This idea is most popular than green anarcho-capitalism and frequently is subject of conference and studies by Narlock in universities and forums. Narlock maintains a project called Árvore do Futuro about eco-modernism, and he wants to transform the project in a think tank. Next slide, please. Here we are illustrating the government actors above and the civil actors bottom. We can think this division from Gramsci's division between political society and civil society, which formulates the idea of integral states. Of these civil society actors, Hélio Beltrão, Mises Brasil, Rodrigo Constantino, Instituto Liberal, and Leandro Narlock have a great space on the mass media and work to dispute the hegemony of Salles' ideas in a certain way. Next slide. Just to add, that's the opinion of Mises Brasil President Hélio Beltrão about Ricardo Salles. The main point here is our ideas or concepts that Brazilian Atlas think tanks develop or reproduce is concentrated mainly in a privatization agenda and policy flexibilization. So there is a convergence between these think tanks and the Bolsonaro government, direct or indirectly. Beltrão is just an example. Okay, Éberson, next slide.
So how Bolsonaro denial starts? Let's put it that way. He starts before he even takes office. In between he winning the election and he taking office. His idea was to abolish the Ministry of Environment of Brazil. The Ministry of Environment of Brazil exists since the early 90s. And as someone from international relations background, it is a key component in Brazil foreign policy and soft power before the Bolsonaro government, in which we were an environmental leader in the world. He wanted to extinguish the Minister of Environment, but he suffered a lot of setbacks of agricultural lobbies and so on, because if you want to sell your rural products to Europe, to another places, you have to keep a good appearances on questions relating to the environment. So he decided to, okay, let's continue then with the Minister of Environment, but at the same time he reduces the power, reduces autonomy, reduces resources, displaces some of the capabilities of the Ministry of Environment to the Ministry of Agriculture, for example, and so on. And who will run this Minister of Environment? He did not want. He finds his minister in Ricardo Salles, which, as Lucas illustrated, has very deep ties with the right-wing think tanks that he described earlier. And under his leadership, the Minister of Environment still has two of main fiscalization deforestation projects. That is the ICMBio here and the IBAMA. And Salles is an interesting figure. He got very known last year because of a saying, this phrase of his during internal secret at the time a meeting, ministerial meeting, where he said that it was the time they should take the opportunity while the media attention was on COVID for them to pass the legislation and facilitate, basically liberate deforestation and so on, and make more difficult to punish people who did deforestation and illegal activities on the environment. We are now 2.5 years into the Bolsonaro administration, so we can see a little bit more of his Green Deal, his policy and governance on environment, and we can see here a little bit some numbers on the rise of deforestation in the Amazon. This past month in April, the highest rise in deforestation in comparison with April, and in historical series from INPE, that is our a governmental body who maps deforestation in Brazil. But not so. The Amazon rainforest is usually the one that gets most attention internationally. But we have Pantanal, with biome, which has a pretty big area, and last year had 1/3 of its area devastated by great fires. The government had these governmental bodies defunded, basically, and they did not really help. And the argument was that, these fires happen every year and so on. But well, one fire that decimates 1/3 of land of a specific biome. In this case here, I bring the comparison with it. That's like 60% of the Netherlands, but and well, that's lost right now. And here I develop the idea more in the paper, but mainly we bring here how do the eco-modernism, how do this anarcho-capitalism, green anarcho-capitalist ideas that from these think tanks, which has many connections with these actors in government, mainly our Ministry of Environment, how do they find place from this consensus building on the political society that Gramsci describes? How do they find place into the actual policy, into the governance, now that they are in power in many ways? We call it here deinstitutionalization strategy, basically. It starts usually with here everything institutional. So institutional delegitimation, for example, basically. It starts, we don't need a Minister of Environment or a Minister of Environment. We can erase that ministry. When in case more specific cases, the federal police, that is one of the main governmental bodies that does fiscalization here on deforestation and so on. We had a case past month where they did apprehend a lot of sets of illegal wood from illegal deforestation, and they Salles and many of the governmental actors were fast to say no. The federal police did something wrong. These are businessmen who took this route, this land, these trees, and try to shape, not shape, to turn the guilt. Oh no, these guys don't have to. The federal police that has to aggressively show these guys did illegal extraction when they already have built a case, for example, extensively, and the illegal deforestators that don't have anything documental, no legal documentation to do what they did, for example. So they operate first in this delegitimation of society, of institutions, And then they're working in other ways. Here, this is a work in progress, as I've said, but taking from their practice, then they have this investment that, like I said, from the Minister of Environment and other bodies, or other governmental bodies. Decoupling that I'm calling here, which is basically, we have an interview from one chief police from the federal police that did this fiscalization on deforestation, and he talks like, since the Bolsonaro government started, usually the modus operandi would be the federal police would work with IBAMA, that is under the Minister of Environment, and they would do both fiscalization, and they would punish cases against illegal deforestation. And since then, IBAMA vanished. They started to the cooperation started to fade out, and now the IBAMA doesn't work with them anymore, for example. And so I'm calling this for now the institutional decoupling, more or less. And other more normal tactics or concepts, the obstruction that is well known between denialists and occupation that we're calling, when some leader of some, for example, this chief of police comes out and says something that they do not like, or do some action like a big apprehension of illegal wood extraction, they act to take that guy out, to fire him in the case. And we have a series of these events. This chief of police was fired, for example, and then they try to put someone else more aligned with the line of thoughts in their places. So yeah, that's why the Bolsonaro. This is one of the reasons we went for this research, given that we have lots, like yesterday, we had lots of presentations talking about far right movements and parties in Europe and so on. But we have very few cases in general of full denialists to achieve the presidency and to get into government like this. Lucas?
Okay, to conclude and connect the points, think tanks reproduce environmental counter ideas, and the Bolsonaro government adopt these ideas as arguments to conduct and to justify its policies. Bolsonaro and his ministers, Ricardo Salles, aren't necessarily eco-modernists or green anarcho-capitalists, but his policies find basis in this kind of idea in a certain way. In this sense, more than destroy the environmental policies and institutions that could be enforce the environment policy rules. Bolsonaro government searches to build a new institutionalization based on the environmental denialism. And at the same time, these think tanks are disputing hegemony of environmental denialism or environmental legal flexibilization in a civil society, while are searching to build consensus of these ideas in political society. Okay, that's it.
That's it. Thank you very much.
So first of all, I just want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present at this event. It's been fantastic so far, at least what I can see. I wasn't willing to get up at 3 in the morning for some of it, but the stuff that I've seen has been terrific. So my name's Shane Gunster, and I teach in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. And my presentation today is entitled Subsidizing Denial, Network Dynamics of Social Media and News Discourse on Canadian Facebook. Okay. So the background for this paper is research that I've been doing on the evolving communication strategies of the oil and gas industry in Canada to promote and legitimate their activities to a Canadian public that really is becoming or has become increasingly concerned about the negative environmental impacts of the sector, as well as more accepting of the need to transition away from fossil fuels. And some of this is included in a chapter that's recently published in a book entitled The Regime of Obstruction, which profiles research of the Corporate Mapping Project, which is an interdisciplinary Canadian initiative to map how corporate power in this country influences policymaking and public opinion on climate and energy politics. Over the last 5 years or so, there really has been a significant shift in terms of industry thinking about how to engage in the battle for hearts and minds. And in a nutshell, actively targeting and mobilizing supporters through social media has become an increasingly important part of the communications of industry and its supporters. So in 2015, for example, the Canadian Association for Petroleum Producers, which is the main lobby group for industry in Canada, they unveiled a new public engagement plan, as they called it, profiled in their trade association magazine context, which signaled three key things. One, an emphasis on key constituencies most likely to support industry rather than going after the public as a whole. Two, mobilizing those key constituencies to become active industry champions with their friends, their family, and social networks. And three, an increasing reliance upon social media as not only a more effective and efficient delivery vehicle for industry messaging, but also as a space for creating active and vibrant online communities of supporters. So at the initial stage of this research, we looked at a number of actors ranging from the public outreach arms of industry lobby groups, such as Canada's Energy Citizens from CAP, the Canadian Association for Petroleum Producers. Sorry, Mike, there we go. Oil Respect from the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drilling Contractors, although as a little marker of that we're having some victories in this battle, that group this morning announced that they were changing their name from oil to energy. So they've taken oil out of their name. I guess they realized that's not particularly effective anymore. And we also looked at a handful of supposedly arm's length supporter groups such as Canada Action and Oil Sands Strong. And what we found is that these groups are having a lot of success on social media, building sizable constituencies of supporters and mobilizing them to become highly engaged on platforms such as Facebook, much more so in some cases than industry critics. Now, campaigns like these are often dismissed as astroturfing, purely orchestrated top-down initiatives that have no genuine connection to real communities or publics. And I think in some cases that is definitely the case. But we found Edward Walker's concept of subsidized publics to be a more useful framework for understanding what's going on here. The key idea being that corporate and industry resources are used to facilitate the enhanced participation of particular groups in the public sphere, and that gives them a conceptual and an organizational coherence, a focus, and an elevated profile and impact in the media and in public spheres, which they wouldn't have had without those resources. Now, we initially did that work in 2017-18, and with this more current research, I wanted to explore how this dynamic has unfolded on Facebook around climate change. So the previous stuff looked at energy, this looks more at climate change. And so I used CrowdTangle to collect all posts with 50 or more interactions with the keywords climate change and global warming or global warming from public Canadian Facebook pages between December 1st, 2019 and December 1st, 2020. I had to do a little bit of manual curating of those results, but I ended up with a final sample of 10,356 posts from 769 pages that posted content or that linked to just under 1,200 organizations, groups, and individuals. And in total, those pages and links generated 4.75 million interactions, so likes, comments, shares, and emotive reactions. And then based upon a review of all of the posting and linked to groups, I classified what was almost 1,500 unique actors into 34 distinct types based upon a number of characteristics, including perspectives on climate change and policy, political and ideological orientation, organizational priorities, their function within civil society, the communicative practices they engage in, and their role in civic engagement and mobilization. And Those 34 groups were then clustered into three broader groups or networks based upon broadly shared orientations to climate change. So I have a pro-climate action cluster, an anti-climate action cluster, and then a mixed neutral cluster. This is a network map of the different actor types, the links between them, the volume of traffic circulating through the networks, and the total engagement generated by each actor type. The legend explains how that map works, or explains the color coding schematic of the map. I won't go through it, just given the limits of time, but you can hopefully have a look at that. So as that map makes pretty clear, one of the key findings from the research is that the core form of network building activity for most of these actors is linking to news. Over 80% of all the engagement that was generated when one actor linked to another actor went to one of 5 news actor types, and primarily mainstream media, which includes public and commercial media, alt-right media, or progressive alternative media. Now, where our earlier work explored how pro-industry groups subsidize publics, what this research identifies is the importance of civil society actors in subsidizing audiences, audiences for news media, by driving user traffic and engagement to particular stories, authors, and outlets. So we know that news continues to be the principal source of information for most people about climate change. And we know that people are increasingly reliant upon intermediary platforms like Facebook, Google, and others to access news. And there's been a lot of attention to the role that surveillance-based algorithms, for example, play in the creation of echo chambers in which people are increasingly exposed only to news that affirms their biases and beliefs. Less attention, however, has been given to how civil society actors also serve in this intermediary role, and play an active role in curating, promoting, and amplifying news content that fits their political and ideological perspectives. In the past, this kind of intervention was commonly managed through the provision of information subsidies, in which PR departments would provide prepackaged content to journalists and publishers, which they could then easily spin up into news stories with minimal efforts. And these practices of media management and propaganda are, of course, more common than ever and continue to be a highly effective means by which ideas and arguments can effectively be laundered as they are passed through circuits of media production. But these supply-side interventions, I argue, are increasingly complemented by demand-side forms of intervention, audience subsidies, in which actors in civil society motivate and mobilize their often sizable audiences to, in effect, subsidize the consumption and circulation of favorable news content. And beyond shaping the views of those audiences and thereby creating and expanding networked publics that come to share common forms of identity and worldviews, this also sends powerful signals to news outlets themselves about what type of content is most likely to attract a lot of audience attention and go viral. And this is something that many news outlets have become desperate to do, as the direct and indirect revenues from digital engagement occupy an increasingly important position in their business model. And the short story here is that, at least on Facebook in Canada, the right-wing anti-climate action network is way more efficient and effective at generating these subsidies than the left. So let's dig a little deeper into that data to explore that further. So in analyzing audience subsidies, we need to consider 2 basic things. One, the subsidizers, those actors that are directing social media traffic to news. And 2, the subsidized, those organizations that are the beneficiaries of these subsidies. Now, as I'm sure you all know, Facebook has different types of engagement: likes, shares, comments, and emotive reactions. And some types of engagement are more valuable, much more valuable than others, especially when it comes to subsidizing news. So shares, for example, arguably have the biggest impact in terms of expanding the reach and the circulation of material as it ripples out and through social networks. News that is mediated through the personal recommendation of a friend generally appears more credible, relevant, and newsworthy than news that is delivered in a more impersonal institutional context. It also often generates explicit notifications. A friend has shared this particular link, so higher engagement that way. Comments are equally important in terms of shaping user perceptions of how other people are thinking and feeling about an issue or argument, and they can be especially influential in cultivating doubt or skepticism about official narratives. They also shape how journalists, editors, and publishers assess the response of audiences to particular stories, topics, and arguments. Likes, in contrast, I argue, represent a more passive form of engagement that has much less impact in terms of elevating the profile or amplifying the reach of a particular item. So with these distinctions in mind, let's take a look at the engagement metrics of the subsidizers in the pro and anti-climate action networks. So this bar chart shows the average likes for each of the group types in the network. So the pro-climate network actors here are on the left, and the anti-climate network actors are on the right. So the average, what I'm calling passive engagement for the anti-climate network, is a bit higher. They average just over 112 likes per item, as compared to the pro-climate network that averages around 96, just under 100 likes per item, but they're pretty comparable. Okay, now let's look at overall engagement. So again, we have the pro-climate actors here on the left and the anti-climate on the right. And when we add in more active forms of engagement, shares, comments, and reactions, we see that the right-wing anti-climate network generates significantly higher levels of interaction with news items from their audiences. So average total interactions with news links from the right were more than twice as high as on the left, 227.6 for when pro-climate actors, when they would post a news link, that was the average interaction, as compared to 467.1 when the link was posted by an anti-climate actor. And when we isolate shares and comments, which I argued are the most valuable and high impact form of engagement subsidies, the differences are even more striking. So news links from anti-climate actors shared, again, more than twice, about 2.5 times the rate compared to news links from pro-climate actors, 134 to 60. And the average number of comments per item was almost 4 times higher. So how do these subsidies translate in terms of shaping engagement with news organizations on Facebook? How do they affect the subsidized? So to illustrate this, I use a scattergram chart that shows how these subsidies are distributed among the most prominent news outlets. And a reminder here and a caveat, so I'm using the term news here in a very broad sense that includes both traditional news organizations as well as more partisan media that is often presented as news, but which really doesn't practice journalism in any sense of the word. So this chart includes all the most prominent news organizations in the sample. The y-axis here plots the total engagement subsidy from all of the interactions generated by links from pro and anti-climate action networks for particular news actors. So the subsidies from the pro-climate network are in blue, and the subsidies from the anti-climate network are in red. The x-axis then plots the proportion of that interaction that consists of shares and comments. So the further along the x-axis to the right of the chart, the more valuable that subsidy is in terms of generating active engagement for particular outlets. And obviously, the first thing that jumps out from that chart is that the engagement subsidies from the right-wing actors tend to involve a lot more active interactions. Now, the principal beneficiary of these subsidies by a huge margin was Postmedia, which is an ideologically conservative newspaper chain that regularly champions the interests of the fossil fuel industry and attacks climate policy, and most often through a stable of hard right columnists and pundits. So here, for example, are their lead climate offerings from a couple of weeks ago, headlined by a column from the former owner and publisher of the paper, Conrad Black, attacking environmentalists for fear-mongering about the climate crisis. Their most rabid climate commentator, probably the highest profile columnist on climate in Canadian media, which really is a sad reflection on the state of Canadian media, is Rex Murphy. This use of Earth Day to mock climate advocacy as little more than a religious cult is pretty standard stuff for him. Links to post-media content generated close to 250,000 interactions, and virtually all of that, over 90% of it, came from the Anti-Climate Action Network, much of it funneled directly to columnists like Rex Murphy. Now, in number 2 spot, just to show this comparatively, in terms of audience subsidies, was the CBC. So that's Canada's public broadcaster. They received just over 100,000 interactions from links provided by pro and anti-climate networks. Now, the CBC is more cautious on energy and climate than many of us would like, but its reporting on climate change is of a much higher caliber than Post Media. It often provides strong commentary and analysis about key scientific and political and economic dimensions of climate change. And it tends to pay attention to local issues and communities that aren't well served by commercial media. As you might expect, pro-climate actors were responsible for most of the links to its content. And so if we compare the pro-climate subsidies for the CBC to the anti-climate subsidies for Post Media, what do we find? 308 links to CBC items from pro-climate actors compared to 418 to Post Media from anti-climate. 218, or yeah, just under 220 average engagement subsidy to the CBC compared to almost 3 times higher for Post Media. And that includes 60 shares for each CBC story and 146 for Post Media. So again, almost 3 times higher for the right. The most fervent engagement of conservative audiences, however, was reserved for Canadian alt-right outlets, and we do a good job of producing those. So these include the Post-Millennial, Rebel News, True North. Names probably don't mean anything to you, but they're up-and-comers here, as well as U.S. imports such as Breitbart, and of course the patriarch of online climate denial. What's up with that? It's sobering to reflect upon the fact that 58 anti-climate action posts linking to the Post-Millennial, so a hard right source, kind of similar to Breitbart, that generated more total engagement from Facebook audiences than 310 posts from pro-climate action actors linking to the CBC. And similarly, 34 links to the far-right Rebel News were shared more on Canadian Facebook than 84 links to the New York Times or 105 links to The Guardian. So the short story is that at least on Facebook, right-wing actors have become really, really good at using audience subsidies to do 2 things. 1, to sustain and defend enclaves of denial and obstruction within mainstream news organizations. And 2, to build and expand robust ecosystems of far-right media that not only cultivate hostility to climate action, but entangle that hostility with pernicious discourses and ideologies of racism, authoritarian populism, and right nationalism. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much, and love to hear any questions or comments in the discussion. Thanks.
I'm currently a master's student in the State University of Campinas. Can you see it full screen?
Yes.
And I'm glad, okay, thank you. And I'm glad to see other Brazilian colleagues in this panel with very important presentations. And for my presentation, I would like to focus on the local dimension of climate change coverage and climate change perception. So this project is part of a bigger research project about multi-actor and multi-level climate change governance in cities of the state of São Paulo. And to start, I would like to talk a little about dimensions of climate change perception, specifically what is called climate change hyperopia. In other words, the perception that climate change risks are far away, both in time and in space. And there are many reasons for this perception, because climate change science started with global climate change projections that were much more accurate than regional projections for specific cities, specific states, and specific countries. So most of the references of the climate change debate started at the international arena. So you have scientists in the International Panel for Climate Change, you have presidents and prime ministers that participate in diplomatic conferences about climate change, and also transnational NGOs. And this is a context that can foster skepticism and denial when you can't relate the abstract climate change risks to your local, personal context. On this chart on the right, you can see that only 15% of Americans in 2020 said that climate change would personally affect them a great deal, while for plant and animal species and future generations of people, this number is more than 3 times higher. So in the news media, this also happens. You have this data for Brazil between 2005 and 2008, in which the publication frequency of climate change news in national newspapers was 4 times higher than the publication frequency in local newspapers. So again, you have this lack of references in the regional scales. They are concentrated in national and international discussion. And this is very related to the conventional news media logic. It's very related to the disseminated use of wire services that generate a big uniformity in the coverage. You don't have many references on the local level that can talk about regional climate change and integrate to the objectivity and newsworthiness criteria in the media, such as sources in the international level that integrate very well because there are politicians, prominent scientists that have media coverage directed to them. So to generate regional production of climate change news, you need local science, you need institutional developments about it. And in this context, science is a key player because it is very perceived as a source of credibility, a source of objectivity. And so it can integrate to the news criteria very well. I will talk a little about that on the case of Santos. You can see on the image on the right, it is the beach on the city of Santos, and it is going through an acute erosion process. It is disappearing over time, and until the scientific production of climate change studies associating that impact to climate change, you didn't have political pressure to undertake adaptation efforts or mitigation efforts in the city because the risk was very undistinguished. There was a lot of noise about it. There wasn't a scientific association. And the beach is a public symbol for the city associated to quality of life, to tourism and revenues, and the identification of the risk creates public pressure over the local administration. So the 3 cities that I'm analyzing, they all have regional climate studies, starting by Santos, that has the Metropolis Project, which is an international initiative that studies all of the cities. In Broward County, you have the Regional Climate Change Compact that unifies the counties at the south of Florida, and is a voluntary collaboration between the local commissioners, the local policymakers, and they seek to create regional projections and also to lobby higher levels of government for grants and for policies to help the region. And lastly, you have Selsey, which has a bottom-up initiative that is the Manhood Peninsula Partnership that was born from the initiative of 2 professors and resulted in a huge coastal realignment project to protect the city from rising sea levels. For the methodology, it is an analysis of the print media in each of these regions, and it seeks to identify how the development of science and regional governance impacts the climate change coverage in these regions. And also, it can give us a clue about which sectors are fostering or hindering political action in these coastal cities. So the main focus of the analysis is to analyze who is saying what. Do you have scientific sources, you have economic and political sources, and one of the most important frames that are being mobilized are accountability and uncertainty. Accountability emphasizes the relation between science and politics. If it can be denouncing the lack of use of science in political action or praising it. It has these two directions. So starting by Santos, it is very vulnerable to sea level rise. And for a long time, it has been dealing with storm surges, with landslides, and extreme events related to rainfall. These two areas in the map are the southeast zone, a high-income neighborhood near the shoreline that is suffering with the accelerating erosion process with violent storm surges and flooding, and the northwest zone, which is a low-income area that is subject to landslides and also to flooding. So for a long time, these issues were tackled by the civil defense, which had a very short-term approach that blocked a comprehensive analysis of climate change. And this only changed with the Metropolis project that identified the regional climate change risks and led to the establishment of the Municipal Committee for Climate Change. In this chart, you can see the main sources and you can see the impact of science in the local coverage. On the top of the chart, you can see the main actors, which are the Metropolis project and the University of São Paulo. The red color equals to state level sources and the blue color to city level sources. And it is interesting to see the Secretary of Urban Development, which is also involved in the Metropolis project and indicates a cross-cutting approach to climate change from now on. It is seen as integrated to urban development, not competing with urban development. So some of the projections, 70% of the city is vulnerable to sea level rise events. And the Metropolis project also calculated the economic impact of climate change, which is a main source of political pressure. You can see that the real estate developers, the portuary sectors are now thinking more long-term since they have these projections and the damage that climate change will have upon them. As you can see, the cost-benefit ratio for adapting is of at least 24 times the cost of cumulative climate change impacts. So to show some discourse moments, first you have the release of the scientific projections in 2015, and you have the scientists stressing the value of the local administration cooperation with the scientific project. And then 1 year later, you have huge storm surge events in the high-income neighborhood of Ponta da Praia. And the scientists' discourse starts to become more critical regarding the public administration. They start mobilizing the accountability frame, and they really act as a pressure group, pressuring for the adoption of a climate action plan and pressuring for concrete measures in the direction of adaptation and mitigation. So now you can see citations from these scientists. For example, it is the moment to pressure the sitting administration, or it is needed a decision based in scientific aspects and not in guessing. And so again, an accountability frame. You also have an uncertainty frame, and here the port is a crucial sector that has been resisting more robust adaptation measures. So there is this uncertainty frame in which the port's dredging is seen as a cause of the beach erosion. There is this conflict between port and city. And you see from the port a discourse that sea level rise is not so urgent, that are priorities higher than climate change. So you can see that they have this short-term perception in space and time. They feel that the impacts are gonna take a little while, that there are competing priorities, which is a discourse that's very common in the global south. And for Broward County, you have actually the city of Fort Lauderdale, Dania, and Hollywood that are suffering with flooding, with saltwater intrusion. And the compact launches sea level projections for these areas. The first discourse moment is the launching of a regional climate action plan. And you can see how the compact influences policymakers' perceptions, as they are very influenced by these new projections that are being produced regionally. With the adoption of the county action plans, you see that there is a mobilization of the accountability frame, but in a less critical way than happened in Santos, because most of the sources of the compact are also involved in the local administration. So it is not very interesting for them to appear publicly criticizing the administration in the media. So you have a discourse that is more focused on progresses, on how they are the first responders, the pioneers. You have a less critical discourse because their position is different when you compare them with the scientists in Santos that are from the Metropolis project that is independent. The next discourse moment, here you have a moment of open denialism, where Governor Rick Scott from Florida unofficially banned the term climate change from any public communication. And now you can see that regarding the state level, you have the mobilization of a more critical frame by the scientists from South Florida, because the launching of the compact was exactly responding to discontinuous state level action. You also have the economy frame. More than one project have calculated the costs of climate change impacts in Florida, and you can see that there is a development of a more long-term thinking by part of the real estate developers in the area, because there is highly valuable property in the shoreline, as in the case in Santos, and that absolutely fosters the governance process and the political pressure to address climate change. So Selsey maybe is the most interesting case and the most complex, because it has seawalls since 1956 responding to beach erosion, and it is a very small city that doesn't have such autonomy as Santos and Broward County. It has only 10,000 residents and is located in the West Sussex County that has over half of its area in natural resources, reserves. So including, you have the Chichester Harbor that was officially named as the area of outstanding natural beauty. So you have this very rich environment that brings to the coverage environmentalist groups such as the Harbor Conservancy, the South Coast Alliance, that defend these areas and are main sources in the local debate. So the region of Selsey has experimented with this coastal realignment scheme, in which you can see that there was a hole made in the seawall to let the water into the natural reserves and creating wetland habitat. So instead of hitting the city, the water gets into the natural reserves and create more habitat instead of damaging property. And one problem that is a huge issue right now in the region is that after the Brexit process, it is a little easier to build on the areas that were natural reserves that were protected before. So this is a major problem because in 2021, the Chichester district reviewed its local development plan and allowed for the construction of more than 800 houses in land that was protected and is going to be flooded in a couple of decades in the Manhood Peninsula. So you have some discourse moments. You have the moment of risk amplification with the scientific projects, and you have the mobilization of the accountability and also of a morality frame regarding future generations, regarding our granddaughters, grandfathers. There's also an interesting detail that over 40% of the population of Selsey is over 65 years of age. So you can see this constant reminding of the future generations of our granddaughters. So because it is speaking directly to this audience. So this is a quote for Dr. Cobbold, which was the founder of the Manhood Peninsula Partnership. And she is a major scientific reference in the local debate. And lastly, you have what's going on right now. Since 2019, you have the pressure to build roads in protected area. And now you have the review of the local development plan that allows for speculative development in the area of the Manhood Peninsula. So the environmental sources are the major actors in the coverage. Different from Santos and Broward, where the political and the scientific sources really dominated the debate. Here you have the natural reserves, and so the environmentalist organizations are a major source of news. So you have this very critical discourse moment in which they call for urgent action. So it is insane to build homes on the low-lying lands, having the risk definition that shows that they are going to be flooded because of rising sea levels in a couple of decades. So for the conclusions, I think it is very interesting to compare the cities because how far can the risk definition influence the policy? You can see in Santos and Broward that the real estate sectors, they pressure for adaptation because there is very valuable property on the shoreline suffering the impacts of climate change right now. As for in Selsey, you have this green protected land, and there is a huge pressure in the opposite direction of adaptation. They see the green land and they want to build, they want to develop it and turn it into urban residency. So there is this pressure from the district government, from real estate developers, and also from the national government in the UK, saying that they need to develop this area because it will make the rent cheaper. And so you can see that they have a very short-term thinking because they are going to develop an area that's going to be flooded in a couple of decades. So I think this is very interesting. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so before I begin, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for giving me the opportunity to share my research with this audience. In this paper, I should say it's a work in progress. It's an incomplete paper. I have not yet incorporated all the empirical evidence that I collected for this research project. In this paper, my goal is to understand the barriers to low carbon energy transition in Bangladesh, a climate vulnerable country in South Asia. To analyze, to understand these barriers, in this paper, I am focusing on a very particular aspect. I look at the dynamics of state-business relations and how this dynamic shapes the policy-making processes, particularly in the energy sector. So, sorry, I have to remove this. Okay, so I begin this presentation with Bangladesh's commitment to a low carbon development agenda, which it unveiled in its climate change strategy and action plan in 2009, where it briefly talked about, the government talked about its desire to contribute to global mitigation efforts and gradually move towards a low carbon development framework. So this happened in 2009. 1 year before that, the Energy Ministry published its renewable energy policy, where it set a target to generate 10% of electricity from renewable energy sources by 2020. Recently, in 2018, the Planning Ministry published another major policy document, Bangladesh's Delta Plan 2100, which recommended using renewable energy to generate 35% of electricity by 2041. So these are the policy targets laid out in the last decade. But as of May 2021, the contribution of renewable energy is less than 3%. So this is one set of policy document I just mentioned, and there is another set of policy documents that came out in last decade. And here I'm focusing on two policy documents in the energy sector: Power System Master Plan, first created in 2010, and a revised version was unveiled in 2016. The key objective of Power System Master Plan 2010 was to ensure electricity for all by 2021, the year of Bangladesh's 50 years of independence. So this plan, PSMP 2010, recommended using coal to generate 50% of the estimated 30 gigawatt of electricity by 2030. And the revised version unveiled in 2016 reduced the use of coal from 50 to 35% to generate an estimated 60 gigawatt of electricity by 2041. However, this revised version of Power System Master Plan in 2016 is recommended use of renewable energy is less than 7% by 2051. So we see that there are different policy targets set out in different policy documents in both prepared by both the Planning Ministry and the Energy Ministry. But the progress towards adopting low carbon development agenda or increasing the use of renewable energy as a significant source of power is still very negligible. On the other hand, we see we can look at Bangladesh government's official position in various global forums regarding its commitment to move towards a low carbon energy, low carbon development agenda. In the UN Climate Change Conference in 2016, which is COP22, members of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which includes Bangladesh, made a commitment to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2050. So this is one commitment made by Bangladeshi leaders in the high-profile global forum. And then we see the reiteration of that, repeating the same message by Bangladesh's Prime Minister in COP25 in 2019. And she said that we keep on zero emission. And then recently, in April 2021, during Biden's Leader Summit on Climate Change, she argued that Bangladesh is pursuing a low carbon development path. So we see that there is a large gap between the policy targets or global commitments and the actual achievement in the energy sector, particularly the use of renewable energy, or in other words, a political direction to move towards a low carbon energy future. As I mentioned in the beginning, that as of May 2021, the contribution of renewable energy in Bangladesh's power sector is less than 3%. If you deduct the contribution of hydropower from that less than 3% figure, you will see it is less than 0.5%, because the hydropower was introduced in Bangladesh's power mix sometime in mid 1970s. So nothing changed after that. So in terms of different forms of other renewable energies like solar, wind, and biomass energy, the contribution is very, very low. So we see a gap between these policy targets or desires that Bangladesh government published in various policy documents and also in various global forums. We do not see the implementation of those in reality. So I am asking in this paper, why is there a discrepancy between policy rhetoric and the reality in Bangladesh's transition to a low carbon energy future? Why do political and bureaucratic elites deviate from their national policy targets and their international commitments to gradually decarbonize development? As a student of political economy, what factors, forces can we discover to understand this gap in order to make a nuanced sense of barriers to transition towards low carbon energy future? So to understand, to inquire about these two questions I just mentioned, I draw on recent scholarship on political economy of energy transition, the works by Peter Newell, Catherine Hostetler, and others in this field of political economy of energy transition. These scholars underscore the role of vested interests, the behavior, underlying interest and incentives, and partisan politics of political and bureaucratic elites in shaping the policy agenda on energy transition. Various scholars in this field, they look at the role of the state in sustainable energy transition. They emphasize whether a state can exercise its policy autonomy vis-a-vis the role of various external and internal interests in the power and energy sector. So, although as these scholars highlight in their analysis of different dimensions of political economy of energy transition, they highlight the roles of external, internal interest. In this paper, I pay particular attention to only internal interest, although during the Q&A, if someone is interested, I can also talk a little bit about the external interest in the context of Bangladesh's transition towards a low carbon energy future. So so this is one aspect that I picked up from this literature. The other aspect from this literature on political economy of energy transition is that the energy transition is a messy business. It's a complex political agenda in which divergent actors having uneven power and capacity and divergent interests are engaged in a battle to either maintain the existing or adopt an alternative energy system. So I pick this up to apply this particular notion that there are divergent actors in this messy business of making decisions about energy transition, and these actors operate in a system where they have uneven power, they have uneven capacity to influence decision-making process in a particular way to advance their interest, and these interests are very divergent. So, for example, industry actors may be powerful than civil society actors, environmental groups, and subaltern activist groups located in different coastal communities, which will be hard hit by any climatic events. So, as I mentioned, I picked up some ideas, very useful, crucial ideas from the literature on political and economy of energy transition. But I also bring insights from the literature on state-business relations in South Asia, particularly works by Atul Kohli and his colleagues, who published a book recently, State-Business Relations in India, which I find very useful as countries in South Asia operate more or less in a similar fashion, which Atul Kohli and his colleagues outlined in their book on India. So from their work, I find it very useful to deploy this notion of instrumental power of business in shaping policy choices in a particular political context. Instrumental power, that is power arising from the connections between the political and business classes. So it's the interactions between political and business classes, or revolving door that work in this dynamic where business people, they move into the positions of political class, or political class people, they have vested interest in various sectors of businesses. So drawing on these analytical issues from both the literature on political economy of energy transition and state business relations in South Asia, I hypothesize that a politically well-connected emerging class of energy entrepreneurs use their instrumental power in Bangladesh to advance their business interests and obstruct low carbon energy transition agenda. In this paper, I'm using empirical data from various sources, both secondary and primary. For the secondary sources, I use policy documents published by Bangladesh's Energy Ministry and Planning Ministry. I also, I forgot to mention here, but I am also using some policy documents from published by the Environment Ministry as well. I rely on newspaper reports on Power System Master Plan that I mentioned earlier. A Special Provisions Act introduced in 2010. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And private sector power producers, their projects, their interactions with policymakers, and corruptions involved in this whole process. So these are the secondary sources that I am using in this paper. Along with that, I'm also using primary source of evidence coming out of my interviews with civil society actors involved with two environmental coalitions in Bangladesh, which created a noise in the public sphere in the last few years regarding coal-fired power plants near the Sundarbans, world's largest mangrove forest, and also a new UNESCO heritage site. So these two coalitions, they galvanized massive popular mobilization against a coal power plant in an ecologically sensitive area. And I also interviewed several energy experts and policy analysts who made significant noise in Bangladesh's public sphere in the last couple of years regarding Bangladesh's choice in the energy sector, in its energy mix, in its overall energy mix. But as I mentioned earlier, this is a work in progress, not very complete stage yet. So I have not yet utilized all my empirical evidence coming from those interview transcripts. I will highlight a few selected items from policy documents, and I'll briefly highlight some of the ideas that I thought significant in understanding the barriers to low carbon energy transition in Bangladesh. So first, I would like to highlight the structural changes in Bangladesh's power sector in during 2010, 2020, in the last decade. So in terms of ownership type, we see significant transformation, significant changes in the last decade. In 2010, public sector's contribution in electricity generation was around 67%, which is now 20% less than that. It is now 47%, a little bit more than 47%. On the other hand, the contribution of private sector has increased significantly in the last decade. If I mentioned here, aesthetic, if we include captive power plants run by private businesses, then the contribution of private sector would be higher than public sector contribution in electricity generation in Bangladesh. Another changes in Bangladesh's power sector in the last decade is the rapid growth of energy entrepreneurs, private sector power producers. So in 2008, the number of IPPs, independent power producers with long-term contract with the government, was only 6. In 2020, it is 51. On the other hand, small independent power producers and rental power producers, which have a very short-term contract with the government, it was 2 in 2008, and in 2020 it is 38. So we see a significant increase in the number of private sector power producers in the last decade or so. And another changes that we notice, which is relevant to our understanding of barriers to low carbon energy transition, is the changes in fuel type to generate electricity in the last decade. In 2010, natural gas was the predominant source of primary energy for electricity generation. In 2020, we see significant decrease in the use of natural gas. On the other hand, we see significant increase in the use of furnace oil and diesel, mostly by independent power producers I mentioned earlier. And here we can see, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the very negligible contribution of renewable energy, particularly solar energy. We see in 2020 it is just 0.19%. So these 3 slides show some transformations, structural transformations in Bangladesh's power sector. So who are behind these structural transformation? I argue in this paper that the emergent class of energy entrepreneurs are significant drivers of this transformation. Bangladesh Independent Power Producers Association has emerged as a powerful trade association in the energy sector, and they emerged as a powerful trade association, not out of blue. A political context, a specific political context, has contributed to their emergence as a powerful trade association. And that specific political context is shaped by a special legal mechanism institutionalized in 2010 that helped them gain power and influence in the energy sector. That special legal mechanism was Quick Enhancement of Electricity and Energy Supply Act in 2010. This act, this special law, allowed Bangladesh's energy ministry to avoid lengthy process of bidding and competition, open market, open competition processes to select, to hire private sector entrepreneur to build a power plant, small, big, or medium. So instead, they negotiated one-on-one basis with private sector power producers. And this particular law was institutionalized in 2010 only for 2 years, considering that at the time, Bangladesh was experiencing severe energy crisis. Power outages were rampant, and according to World Bank's calculation, Bangladesh at the time was losing around 2% of its GDP due to low quality power and power outages, frequent power outages. So the new government, which came in power in 2009, they introduced this legislation to bypass all the all the provisions that are available for the energy ministry to go for the expansion of energy production, electricity generation capacities. So this law allowed them to bypass all those provisions and in order to help them solve the power crisis very quickly. So the law was institutionalized for 2 years, as I mentioned, in 2010. So it is for a period of 2 years between 2010 and 2012. But the law has created a political context which was both beneficial for, I would argue, for these private sector power producers, and also political and bureaucratic elites who can actually capture a certain portion of the rent from these processes. So, because of this symbiotic nature of the political context that emerged because of the implementation of this special legal mechanism, the government, the energy ministry, through parliament, extended the duration of this special act until in several times until October 2021, and media reports highlight that it may be extended further 2 years, 4 years each time the energy ministry feels it necessary. So in this paper, I am arguing that there is a special legislation created a particular political context that is beneficial for both private sector power producers and also people who within the circle of political and bureaucratic elites to capture certain portion of the rent arising out of this transaction in a deals world, which is not a rules-based policy making process. I would talk a little bit about that in a minute. So members of Bangladesh Independent Power Producers Association, politically well-connected businesses took the opportunity to strengthen their interest in the power sector, and thereby their interest can be maximized, as I see from the reading of newspaper reports and also preliminary analysis of my interview transcript. I see that the existing energy mix really guarantees profit maximization for this power sector, private sector power producers. So they will, as rightly pointed out by scholars in the field of political economy of energy transition, if vested interest in a particular political context have enormous power, they can really sway political decisions, policy decisions in their favor, and they will stick to the existing energy system and prevent any opportunity, any scope for a transition towards a new alternative energy system. So I'm here showing you 3 slides from three quotations from recent discussions among political economists, policy analysts regarding the role of private sector in Bangladesh's policy making process. One very renowned scholar, he characterizes the power of private sector, not just power producers, but in general, private sector businesses in different dominant sectors, for example, ready-made garments industry or banking industry. And I would add power producers industry. Their enormous power has led to something that he calls a process of state capture. These private sector entrepreneurs are now a politically dominant force. They are now part of a major part of parliamentarians in Bangladesh's parliament. More than 61% members of parliament are businessmen. And due to lack of very strict legal restrictions to regarding conflict of interest between politicians and businesses, many of the businessmen in Bangladesh's parliament, they keep doing their business works at the same time running political offices, sitting on committees related to various business-related issues with which they have conflict of interest. But since there is no clear-cut legal restrictions, they can do both simultaneously. So this scholar argues that, Professor Rehman Soban argues that businessmen, politicians, and bureaucrats are collectively taking part in formulating and implementing policies of which they are the biggest beneficiaries. So, so private sector entrepreneurs, they are members of parliament.
Sorry, Omar, but we have to finish for the time of the program. Can you finish your
in 1 minute? I'll make okay in 1 minute. So politicians, businessmen, bureaucratic elites, they are now working on the same page from which they get the biggest beneficiaries. And another economist argued that the specific legal context that I mentioned earlier has created a deal-based system instead of a rule-based system in Bangladeshi political policy-making process. So I'll end here that this very short reflection on the power, instrumental power of businesses, given the political context of state business relations, actually shaped the decision-making process in Bangladesh's energy transition politics. Although civil society actors are trying to leverage their voices to influence the decision-making process, so far they have not yet succeeded. So I would argue that these influential business groups, in collaboration with political and business elites, they use their instrumental power to obstruct Bangladesh's transition towards low carbon energy future. Thanks.
I'm very happy to be here today. And Well, as Jose explained, I will talk about the advocacy trap of climate activism, which is a concept that I self-created, but to explain a current situation that is actually going on. So basically, I will make a brief recap on the state of art, on how green is the new red. Then we'll talk about the advocacy trap, about the concept, and about how it articulates this ongoing situation I'm going to explain. Then we are going to evaluate which are the characteristics of this new wave of activism that actually enable this advocacy trap to be broken. And then we will talk about how the COVID pandemic and the digital scenario face new future tendencies for youth climate activism. So basically, in terms of the state of art, we have the climate movements as itself, where in the first place, wait, maybe I will do like that so that you see it better. In the first place, movements such as Greenpeace, that they did huge environmental actions to call for action in environmental spaces, or the indigenous people rights fight, which was also like a very big concentration of demands in terms of nature, land and climate activism. However, with the appearance of Greta Thunberg, the young activist from Sweden, there's been a new wave of climate action and a new wave of climate movements that I think it's important to recall. First of all, for example, with Fridays for Future, demands from the youth in terms of climate emergency, and also the new demands that the digital scenario is enabling. For example, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, that conformed and articulated different inputs or characteristics that made digital activism very, very like a very productive and a very fruitful space for activism. So the increase of consciousness in climate change brings a greater opportunity for young activism to recover the future from its sins in the present. What I try to say with this kind of poetic sentence is that the green movement is now the one who is able to articulate all the other movements and all the other social rights movements in order to generate a common articulation of such demands. If in this 19th century, the socialist movement was this movement that enabled the articulation of the others, now it's the green movement, the one who has this input. And as Dana Fisher, the sociologist from the University of Maryland said, young people are getting so much attention that it draws more young people into the movement. So this new dynamic of climate activism from youngsters are generating itself a biggest dynamic and a biggest catch of the young interests. So despite having really different causes, initiatives, and objectives, they are all, let's say, related in one aspect, which is the solidarity. If the millennial movement was characterized by like different individual icons who were like influencers and were the ones who were impulsing change, this new wave of activism doesn't find like the lead on this hero, but on the objective, on the cause, on the claim. For this reason, empowering these individuals is generating a new wave of solidarity, because the capacity to articulate all this movement is not based on the popularity of one single leader. Despite with Greta Thunberg, we have this exception because she was like the one impulsing it. But the rest of leaders are not willing for, let's say, attention, but for a change in the objective and paradigm, seeing themselves as one more in this wave. Here we have this sentence from Tyrone Scott, which is one of the impulsors of the Young Greens campaigns office. So I don't know if it will be possible, but I will try to share with you the presentation, because I'm skipping some of them for terms of time. So the advocacy trap of climate activism. One of the main challenges of youth activism in the 21st century is this advocacy trap. So if you find like a search in Google Academic, the advocacy trap, you're probably going to find these two articles. The first one from Tiona Zuzul from the London Business School is related to organizational learning. And the second one is from Stephen Noakes, and it's about activism and state power in China. So none of these articles are really related to the topic that we're treating today. But I took this concept of advocacy trap because I think it was really powerful to illustrate what I was trying to say. So the advocacy trap is a paradox that climate activists, especially the younger one, face. So I have this long definition written, but I hope that that will make myself clear. Despite the constant efforts of advocating the system for a real change of paradigm, it is not until the powerful elites consider the warning as a real threat that they will push for a change. And sometimes not even so, because they will use the demands of climate activists to serve their own interests. So then we see that the capacity of youth climate activism to advocacy, to generate awareness and to generate a push for change is sometimes trapped by this trap. I tried to illustrate this here with a kind of a drawing I did myself. So actually the capacity to advocate is limited by two things. By first of all, the intention that the institutions will have to actually absorb these demands. And when the absorption is done, there's another trap, which is the fact that the absorption of the demands may not serve to the common interest, but to interests of some leaders that want to absorb these demands in order to reinforce their own position. So this trap generates the constant feeling of hope in the short term, considering the claims as useless as the activists don't have the actual power to change the situation and to change the paradigm. But despite this losing fear and hope, there's an opportunity because if in the long run they are given enough support and they push for the demands, some action can be taken, but it will not be in their control, the change that they generate. For instance, this happens with the feminist movement. At first, the interests of the demands of the feminists and the suffragettes were absorbed to serve the interests of the privileged classes or of men, but then with enough push for change, it developed feminist policy, a change of social mindset, and legislation against gender equality. So it's kind of this trap that generates that it's if you don't advocate, you don't have any results, but advocating does not guarantee you any results. So it's this kind of trap. Will this new trend of activism be able to break the trap? That's basically the thesis I explained here in the investigation. There's new opportunities that this new wave of activism is bringing that could break this trap and that could generate this new sense of solidarity in the climate change activism. So what are the characteristics of this new wave of activism? First of all, they have the same values of the previous activist climate causes, but they have new energy. They have new ideas, new breathing. So that's something that really empowers the movement. Also, as I explained, they end with this me generation and they avoid this heropreneurship. Then there's the power of the education, not only understood as individual education, but also as the capacity to be more pedagogic with society and to generate awareness and consciousness about climate emergency. Then equality for prosperity. This new wave of activism is very clear that if not everyone commits, no one commits, and that we need to push for a harder change of paradigm. that gives prosperity to all people. And finally, and maybe because of the inheritance of the indigenous movements, they have a holistic view of nature. They see nature as a whole. So describing these characteristics was a bit abstract for me. So I wanted to contrast that with the following case studies. We have Panyal Yahid. She is a World Children's Prize, and she's an activist for the education of girls. We have Chia Bastida. She's an Otomi Toltec indigenous from Mexico, that she received the Spirit of UN for her administration of People Climates movement. We have Big Barrett. He was he felt firsthand the Hurricane Sandy, and now is a great activist of the advocacy for climate change in the government of the US. We have Vanessa Nakate. She's probably one of the most known young activists in Uganda. She participated in the COP25. She does this protest with this handmade sheets of paper, and you may remember her from the COP25 picture that they let her off. And then we have Melati and Isabel Wijan, the founders of the Bye Bye Plastic Bags initiative in Indonesia, that achieved the ban of plastic bags in the whole country. So these different activists show how these characteristics of this new wave of solidarity give new air, new impulse to breaking the advocacy trap. But there are two big situations I would like to highlight because they are really recent and they show how this transformation can actually happen. First of all, we have the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic showed how the demands of the activist climate movements had really an effect, and it showed the urgency to respond to the current situation. But it also showed a new fight arena that is the digital scenario. Basically, they bring a new activist toolkit, they bring new opportunities through this digital space, which is the second point I'm going to highlight. In pre-pandemic societies, information was the role of power and the mean how you could exercise actually power. But with the digital scenario, there's a democratization of this expression of this power, of these spaces where activists can push for change. So these new platforms for activism can be promoted either by international organizations or movements that can actually not only be connected and generate a connected space with activism worldwide, but they can also give testimony of events happening broadly. For example, we are able now to watch a demonstration from the other side of the world. We can create awareness and create warning campaigns via, for example, change.org, or we can have advocacy campaigns in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or they can enable spaces for debate, which is an initiative that I think is very important because it can generate exchanges between people from all over the world. And here I highlight Young Med Voices as one example of these initiatives. So basically, the digital space is providing a very big variety of opportunities to stimulate this activist movement, but it also has its threats. It can generate disinformation. It can generate a growth of the populist movement. So we need to be very conscious of how not to enter in this regressive paradigm in democratic rights in the digital scenario. So with that, we have some future tendencies of this new wave of activism. First, we have a rupture with the individualistic dynamics of governments and the social system and the status quo we have right now. We have repurpose. These activists are getting another purpose on what they do. For example, being an activist in your habits, in your consumption habits, for example. They have this confrontation of the individualism tendency and the solidarity tendency. If we all understand each other as members of a big wave of activism and not as this heropreneurship of activism, we can actually consider the cause as shared. And this generates new dynamics. Movements are more plural, more inclusive, and more orientated towards collective solidarity. So with this, if we achieve that the global solidarity is something shared between all citizenship, we can actually break the trap, because if institutions do not find this confrontation with advocacy, but they absorb the demands as a wave of solidarity, there's maybe the chance to break this incapacity of social movements to actually accept their demands, include their demands, and especially to have this capacity to control and to be sure that the demands are being implemented correctly. So I will add you here some of the bibliography that I used for preparing this presentation, and also other bibliography such as press articles that I think that can be useful to understand the concept. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I adjusted to time, and I am open to any critiques, any comments, and any contributions you might have.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you again to the organization for accepting a topic which is usually not very known and which is also delicate. Well, we will see how Christian fundamentalism influences denialism in a categorical way. In fact, I'm starting with a sense of humility, not being a scholar, and especially with a view from the outside, because I'm talking about the USA, but I'm talking from Barcelona, so from Catalonia, in fact, not Barcelona. So a view from outside that hopes to contribute to some misunderstandings I see in the denialist in the denial analysis arena. Well, we will talk about religion, which is a sensible subject. I apologize in advance if someone of you finds some expression inadequate. In fact, I am very respectful for the religious sentiment, and indeed I consider myself a spiritual person. You can find good knowledge and spiritual food, in fact, in every organized religion. Part of my talk will be in theological terms, but in fact, this particular kind of theology and this very specific and tricky way of reading and interpreting the Bible, I say it's not about religion. In fact, it's about power. And we know how power influences denialism. So we talk about fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, which I think it is no less than the fascism of the 21st century. And then I have here a quote from a person who left Germany during the war, the Second World War, who is James Luther Adams, who's a theologian. He's quoted by his people, Chris Hedges, who was a former fundamentalist, in a very important book. They say the Nazis are not going to return with bastikas and brown shirts. Their ideological inheritors in America had found a mask for fascism in patriotism and in the pages of the Bible. And now we will look at this. Another quote this time is from Hannah Arendt, which you know from the origins of totalitarianism. It's bad written. And maybe from the H-Man of Jerusalem. Yeah. The first possessed by totalitarian propaganda lies in its ability to shut down the masses from the real world. There was a scholar in the 60s named Lynn White, which in a paper in Science, I think it was 1967, whose name was The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, okay? And she quoted a passage of the Genesis, which she understood as a generative. That means, that says this. Then God said, let us make in our image and our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. Well, this, in fact, is not the translation from Greek used by Protestantism, and by extension by evangelicalism. This is what is called the New International Version, because the version of the Bible which evangelicalism and fundamentalism, which is roughly equivalent to nowadays, it hasn't been before. The translation that they used is a translation made by the King James I in 1611. They say, and God said, let us make, I didn't, you see that rule over, it is half dominion, and move along this every creeping thing. This means that the language is more mandatory, more dominatory. This is in fact what leads to what is called the dominion theology. Okay. In fact, Lynn White was cherry picking a little, because there are many other passages in the Christian scriptures that are not so mandatory and not so unrespectful for nature and for the world, others than human being. And you even find a book of nature, and you find St. Francis, and you find Hildegarda de Wilden, Meister Eckhart. You find very rich persons, and you find today, of course, the current Pope with the encyclical Laudato Si, which resembles more a manifesto than a proper an encyclical. And although Christian fundamentalism has already landed in Europe, it is mostly a known concept for most Europeans. We identify fundamentalism with the most extreme branch of Islam. Some observers don't see many difference between the practices, current or potential, resulting from both extreme readings of the sacred text, Christian and Islamist. The only difference being that we are culturally Christians, and its existence is deemed more tolerable or less dangerous. And in the USA, also, many observers are fascinated by the lack of public awareness of this danger, of this subterranean culture. So they call themselves the movement, and now Spaniards know very well what the movement is. The movement, because the national movement was the only party, the single party of Francisco Franco. So we resonate with it. Well, let's look at the religious sentiment. The religious sentiment is a very special thing because it is, in the words of theologist Paul Tibitz, it is, for believers, it is the ultimate concern. It fosters the deepest obligation. It is the feeling that compels the most. Indeed, God commanded Abraham to kill his son. Finally, he avoided. But he tried to, Abraham. It is the highest idea for which you will give your life for. Yeah? It is the first in the rank. And though in our circles, you want more enlightened, if you prefer, this is considered a private affair, and it's seldom considered. We must recognize this influence, be it soft or hard, in this case, of religion in faithful people, which it expresses themselves if you are conversant with the sentiment or with this theology, and you can identify it. Also in fundamentalist circles, it is not unusual to be compelled under oath. In fact, they call themselves born again. They are born again. Well, let's talk about demographics. Knowing that Christian fundamentalism is a very specific American phenomenon from the United States. We can go back to history to identify it. We will not have the time to do it here, but it is important to know that roughly, no, not 1,000 million. It's 100 million. Okay, you want 100 million, which is 40% of the electorate. They manifest themselves as born-again Christians. Okay, so they are attached to a particular theology that we will review next, which is important because this allows you to identify the messages and the attitudes and even the politics. Okay, you see that the religious adherence has been growing with time in the United States. Okay, this morning I showed this this graph concerning climate denial. In fact, this is the same structure established for the promotion, the dissemination of liberalism, of capitalism way of life. Okay, for climate denial, you have specific think tanks, for example, specific PRs, specific everything. But you have also this for the expansion of Christian fundamentalism. Although we must be careful because general public and media are not usually aware. And this is a particularity of this graph concerning Christian fundamentalism as a whole. Well, the origins have analyzed this, some historians, they analyzed the American Civil War as a theological crisis, because Bible supports slavery, but others insist in an atheist anti-communism backlash after the revolution in the USSR. So let's travel to the last century, and we can see in this important book that the national, in 1942 already, the National Association of Manufacturers began to begin a campaign, a strategy to break down unions, because of fear of communism and because unions were being legislated, were being tolerated, were being even promoted. And in the fossil fuels industry, they realized that a strike in the coal industry, it paralyzes the world. So it was imperative for them, from their point of view, to neutralize the unions, and by extension, all unions. And they did. They did. There appears a person, which is Pat Robertson, who was a televangelist, of course, climate denier for some time, but a very special figure, because at the end of his life, he was a convert. So he admitted maybe climate change and its anthropogenical causes. And you can see that since the 60s, an integrated, mutually reinforcing, self-sustaining subculture with a subtle influence, implicit and hidden, as you can find in many books. I will show you a bibliography at the end of the presentation. The point started in the 60s, in the 60s with three books made from the theoretical person who is at the root of all the new theology. And you will see that this new theology. One book was the myth of nature. The other is the mythology of science, and the Institutes of the Biblical Law. You can see the similarity between this title, the Institutes of the Biblical Law, and the title of the book of John Calvin, which is when the Reform took place in 1526. And this person, Rushdie, was funded by the William Folker Fund. If Dieter Plever was there, he would recognize William Folker Fund because he was also a huge funding for the neoliberalism, and especially the Mont Pelerin Society. And I read a book by Dieter on the Mont Pelerin Society. Well, let's look at the theology. We can distinguish between what is the Protestant, which means the non-fundamentalist, Christians, which are in fact the majority, but not in the United States, and what we can call the evangelical. We say this is the reconstructionism. What do they want? What they want? I don't know. What do they want to reconstruct? They want to reconstruct the Society of Geneva 1600. Geneva 1600 was a very hard society. For example, adultery or gay people were stoned. They were killed. There was death penalty. It was a capital offense. Okay, and they were stoned. This is important. They were stoned on biblical grounds. Okay, it's difficult to believe, but it's like that. Then the Protestant attached to theism, which means a soft God's intervention. It means a watcher, a God that created the world and then watch the events unfold. Not the evangelical. The evangelist is a theist. It means that every event is God's will. So what I'm doing now is because God wants me to do, and it wants me to do this way. This is the worldview of these people. This has a sense of non-responsibility. They are not responsible of their own acts. Then let's divide the theology and culture in the Protestant arena, and theology and how it translates to culture in the evangelical reconstructionist worldview. This is a stuff.
You have 5 minutes, Ferran.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
Wow.
You will need to rush a bit.
Thanks for waiting. Yeah. Well, what is important is that the literalism is the presuppositionalism. Okay, I will accelerate. How do I accelerate? Well, the Bible is the word of God. It is inherent. Even I can combine paragraphs to construct an argument. This is for a PR company. This is the summum. Well, you have here different things. This is what we call dogma. They think this is not a dogma like the Catholic Church, which there are institutionalized dogmas like treaty, etc. No. Here dogma is every word in the scriptures. Okay. Well, this is the quote where the deniers of climate change attach. This, in fact, this is, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake. So the sea level will never rise anymore. Okay, this is their interpretation is this one. Well, there were many religious organizations already before the strategy is a Gramscian strategy. They work to a long term, and they have established a new reformation, changing the reading of the book of Daniel, which is from premillenarianism to postmillenarianism. Well, the strategy is to have an enemy. They homeschooled. This is not a joke. There are permanently between 1.5 million and 2 million child educated in school in Christian literalism and as a soldiers of Christ, and they invented the prosperity theology and especially their stealth. They have got with his strategy, they have got the presidents of the United States, and they are everywhere, and they are the elite. This is not a French movement, absolutely not. They are at the elite because they took the 7 mountains of culture. They reached the fusionism, which is the Christian fundamentalism plus libertarianism, and they invented biblical capitalism. You have a key here, the characteristics, the notion of family, and you have from this before. We have here some organizations concerning funding, concerning fusionism, for example, here in Europe, Global Warming Policy Foundation. And here you have the funders. You will find here the usual suspects. The huge communication industry, for example. One example I took is the Conservapedia. Right? This is another world. Go to Conservapedia and you are in another world, an alternative world. Well, now, so John Spencer and John Christie, which are scientists, climate scientists, who made the temperature measurements by satellite. They are fundamentalists, and they are deniers. In fact, they are deniers, okay? And they're very reluctant to correct their own papers or their own numbers. You had Vernon Brown, he is in Huntsville, who was in Huntsville, where Spencer and Christie are. You have Ross McCritic and maybe Steve McIntyre, who were 15 years denying hockey stick. You have Fred Singer, very known, who was funded by the Moons Unification Church. All of this is documented. You have Paul Dreesen, which is at the Cornell Alliance. And you have Arthur C. Robinson from the Petition Project. And you have even Freeman Dyson, who was a climate denier. Okay, which I think it's a Nobel Prize in Physics. Well, he was a fundamentalist. Okay? Politicians, some names that you can maybe recognize, of course, Steve Bannon, Enrique Santorum, and Ted Cruz in La Haye, and Rex Tillerson, who was the president of ExxonMobil. He is a fundamentalist. He was Secretary of State under Donald Trump. Betsy DeVos was Betsy DeVos was the Secretary of Education under Donald Trump, and it is the cousin of Eric Prince, who is the owner of Blackwater. Huh? Okay, Blackwater. But be careful, Christianism is not to blame, I insist. I'll give you the bibliography. I have prepared for you 84 books about Christian fundamentalism. They are very relevant. And I found 65 books from Christian fundamentalists, when you can see the theology, the biblical economics, and so on. You see that we are losing. No? Here are my best recommendations, especially this one, the family. This is the most revelatory, I think, because he went as an insider to examine it. Well, conclusions, but the fusionism between Christian fundamentalism and libertarianism controls the most power speed industry ever designed. The culture war is not about ideology or one reason or another reason. It is against reason. You know? So it means that our weapons, so scientific evidence, counter argumentation, evincing denial evidence, communication strategies, are not only efficient, but often counterproductive, because, well, it is important to know that the enemy for them is secular humanism. So we are the enemy, but not only the enemy. We are the devil, and they have a maximum. They never compromise with the devil. Right? This is very important. This is inside the structure of the personality of roughly 100 million people. So words like anti-science, irrational stewardship, notions of sin don't work anymore. Don't work for them. Huh? Yesterday, Bernard Forstner talked about, was surprised because he divided far right and extreme right. And he found that extreme right was less denial. They accepted the climate change, the extreme right, different from the far right. So I guess it's an hypothesis that the extreme right in Europe, extreme, is the parallel with the USA, the Christian fundamentalism in the USA, and then. For them, the climate change, in fact, the apocalypse, the collapse, the economic collapse is a theological necessity because it is written in the scriptures. So that's climate change, okay, that's human cost, okay, that's because God wants. Yeah? But they will never accept intervention from the government, never. And I think this paper might be non-convertible. Okay, finally, we are on the what is called the reality-based community. This is a quote from Karl Rove, which I think was Secretary of State or something like that. They said, you are, he was talking with a journalist, he said, you are in what we call the reality-based community. People who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. But we're an empire, and when we act, we create our own reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore. We are history actors, and you, all of you, so we will be left to just study what we do. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I am going to present some first results of my PhD project, where I investigate the influence of right-wing populist parties on climate change discourses. So we heard already that doubts and skepticism regarding human-made climate change, or also climate sciences, are important issues in science and, of course, society and politics. And one common feature of many, of course not all, climate change deniers is a tendency to right-wing populism or far-right ideologies. So also the first keynote speaker, Bernard Fortner, actually hold an interesting presentation about the link of the far right and the environmental issues, but we heard it constantly during this conference, connections to right-wing ideologies, activists or parties. So we have on one side rising populist movements who are increasingly influencing politics in Europe, in European countries. Their crucial role in shaping discourses was especially noted since the so-called migration crisis in 2015, and accordingly also especially in migration discourses. And various scholars argued also that the rise of right-wing populist parties in Europe and the US has resulted in loss of vote for the mainstream parties. And at the other side, we have on the same time climate change and generally environmental issues which are gaining attention, maybe especially because of the Fridays for Future movement, which afterwards, since then at least, it appeared to be a focus of many policies, media articles, and reports. So putting these two phenomena together, I did use two research questions for my PhD. The first one is, how do RWP or right-wing populist parties frame climate change and transport the topic into their mainstream politics? And secondly, when RWPs address the issue of climate change, do they influence the climate change discourse of other political parties which are left or right of the political center? And if so, to what extent? So yeah, this issue and research questions, they are highly relevant because of a growing number of people deny the existence of human-made climate change, which is a fundamental challenge to the development of efficient climate change protection and adaptation policies at the end. And also in the literature, the rhetoric of politicians has already been identified as a possible source of skepticism. So in order to comprehend the climate change discourse, it is central to understand when and how RWPs take up this topic, and if or which impact they have on other political parties which are competing with those RWPs. And to understand the diffusion of certain climate change discourses, in particular skepticism and denial, the elite rhetoric must also move into the focus of further investigations. So in the context of rising populism in Europe, it is crucial to investigate more on specific actors and their attitudes towards the climate change. And even though climate change is not the main focus of RWPs, like for example, migration would be, many RWPs seem to take up the issue now, and they communicate it in the politics. So research has shown that in the case of environmental or especially climate issues, language, it's also in other issues, of course, but language often determines how different actors interpret processes and phenomena, and then at the end, how they address certain problems. Therefore, I use the discourse historical approach from critical discourse studies. I think it fits these research questions very well, and it has also an interdisciplinary orientation, which allows to go beyond disciplinary restrictions. So these are the key steps of the discourse historical approach I applied. It starts with the problematization, which I already shortly introduced. Then is a consultation of theoretical concepts is needed. Afterwards, the systematic collection of data and also context information starts. And in the methodology step, I selected and prepared the data for the specific analysis, which means also downsizing the data according to relevant criteria. And last, of course, the actual analysis and interpretation. So I will investigate the link between climate change discourses and RWP and and explore the impact on the climate change discourses of other parties. And in order to do that, I formulated hypotheses for until now. I derived them theoretically, but also empirically, and I will specify them also for my different cases. So the first one is, the higher the salience of climate change in society, the more RWPs address climate change in their communication. Then the denial of anthropogenic climate change of RWPs leads to a hostile discourse by RWPs towards actors who support climate change actions. The climate change discourses of RWP leads to a discourse shift of mainstream parties away from global issues towards local national aspects. And lastly, the climate change discourses of RWP lead to a discourse change of mainstream parties away from climate change policies and action towards environmental protection. So I will consider 3 different concepts for my theoretical framework, but I cannot go into detail today. It's not enough time, so I will just name them. It is party competition, the concept of mainstreaming I will use, and also concepts regarding the elite rhetoric. So as already mentioned, my research is based on a case study with 4 different cases, and all of them refer to national RWPs that show in one way or another skepticism or denial towards climate science or human-made climate change or climate protection policies. So the cases are Germany, Spain, Switzerland, and Austria. And I aim to include various documents, so different kinds of documents such as social media data, press releases, party and election programs, parliamentary documents, and policy documents. And doing that, I can include also various or different fields of action to get a broad picture of the entire discourse. So to get a first idea how to present climate change in society is, I firstly looked into Google Trends data, but I won't go into detail also because of the time. Because more importantly, I wanted to see how present the issue of climate change is or was amongst politics. And in order to do that, I mostly relied on social media data of the main political parties of a country. This figure displays the posts of Facebook regarding climate change over the last 10 years of the different political parties in Germany. Here you can see a clear peak in September 2019, for example. This graph shows the salience of climate change of the RWP, which is the AfD in Germany, and their Facebook posts. And here you see that the peak overlaps with the first peak of the general parties. And I did a very short validated check. So I downloaded all the posts of Facebook of all parties for the last 10 years to make sure that the salience of climate change does not coincide with the overall salience of Facebook posts. And yeah, this is the third graph, and it is showing no coincidence. So this is fine. And I'm doing a qualitative discourse analysis, so I'm certainly not able to include all of the data I would like to include, but I needed to downsize it. I had a few criteria, which were that the social media peak, of course, the month where the peaks was selected, so it's time, then likes at Facebook and Twitter posts, and also the relevance. So for the case of the AfD in Germany, and I analyzed 38 documents in total. And doing a critical discourse analysis where very different approaches inside exist, I tried to rely foremost on concepts of Michael Krzyzanowski. However, I had to adapt them also to my special research question and problem, and this figure shortly explains the 3 levels I would like to analyze, or I analyzed. So first, it's the enactment of climate skepticism. This is where I focus on my first research question and concretely on the discourses of the RWPs and their communication. Then in the perpetuation, I move along to the communication of the established parties. So see how they communicated and if there is any change in the last 5 years. And lastly, I will analyze also a possible mainstreaming by investing concrete policy programs. So I start with the enactment of climate change skepticism. I look again into the detail into Facebook and Twitter salience of climate issues of AfD posts in Germany. As you can see here, I was able to identify 3 peaks. The first one I linked to a heat wave in Germany in June 2018. The second actually also coincides with the politicization peak as well as with the Google Trends data of Germany. It was in September 2019 when the Fridays for Future movement was very active also in Germany, and the Youth Climate Summit was organized as well. And the last peak was a few months later during the World Economic Forum, where climate change was also a very present issue. So after this general context, I show you now some details of the discourse analysis. Those are the discourse topics which I identified in the different documents of the AfD. You can see it's a general, the AfD spreads a lot of criticism regarding various actions, actors and topics such as the EU, the energy transition, CO2 pricing, and concretely towards the Green Party. They even created a campaign with the slogan, "Stop the Green Party, Save the Environment." Or they say in Twitter posts things like the energy transition leads to mass unemployment. This energy and climate policy of the federal government lacks any shred of common sense and decency towards workers. So it's pretty populist, of course. And So furthermore, I also used various discourse strategies, and I base it on particular, again, on literature of Mikhail Krzyzanowski, but also Ruth Wodak and Martin Reissegel. So the strategy nomination asks, for example, how persons, events, or actions are referred to linguistically in the discourse about climate change in the AFD communication. Here you can see that the AFD uses a lot of different terms for actors they disagree with in the climate change debate. So examples are car haters, climate hysterics, climate protection fetishists, world climate policemen, eco-socialist world saviors, climate extremists, climate believers, and so on. And based on this and also other strategies, I was able to define an in-group they create in their communication and the out-group. So the in-group is supposed to be the civic conservative for the people, but also for the nature and the homeland. The German interest is emphasized, and the little people as well, they declared themselves even as responsible environmentalists. And on the other side, there is the out-group, where, of course, the elites are, the climate industry in general, the European Union, the German federal government, of course, the Green Party, and they say they have also a stunned understanding of democracy. They implement anti-economic policies and are eco-socialist. And yeah, the climate movement is also part of the out-group. And here I show you very shortly what other discursive strategies are that I include in my analysis. So predication is about the characteristics which are attributed to social actors, events, or actions. And one concrete example is the Green Party, which they often refer to in a rather negative way. For instance, they claim the Greens swim in the left liberal mainstream of the elite and exercise cultural hegemony. Or results of the party conference of the Greens is a mixture of schizophrenia, moral arrogance, all at the expense of the citizens. Or the moralizing green index finger will be painfully felt everywhere. So as you can see, it's just a few examples, but they are very negatively speaking about the Greens. And also another example is Greta Thunberg. They describe her, for instance, as staged youthful icon or as climate activist managed by resourceful PR strategies. And these are just a few descriptions for her. So moving on and going even deeper in the results, I now show you the arguments they used and foremost in the climate change communication. One huge topic, it's no surprise, but it is related to science. They clearly deny anthropogenic climate change and refer frequently to scientific uncertainty, CO2 as indispensable for the plants, the uncertainty of the human impact on climate change, and the weather in general as a factor. Besides that, the AFD often refers to also to costs and negative consequences and to question regarding the future of the country and the people. And on the right, also very present are arguments regarding threats and danger. So danger for the economy, for the prosperity of the country, for the freedom of the people, and of course also for jobs. And lastly, on the bottom, you can see the main three claims they communicate. The first one is to withdraw the Paris Agreement of 2015 and also to withdraw the National Climate Protection Plan for 2050 and in general to stop energy transition. So coming back to my first two hypotheses, I was able to verify both hypotheses for the case of Germany. And now I move on to the aspects of perpetuation. Now I address the second research question about the impact of RWP's climate denial on established parties, which have the established parties, they have no history of denying climate change. So here the data downsizing worked very similarly, and at the end I had in total 56 documents I analyzed for this part. Here I actually made a difference between the years before the peak and the years after the peak of when the AFD talked a lot about climate change. So during the first phase, I identified these main discourse topics. It's biodiversity and species diversity, CO2 generally, economic growth and economy and labor, as well as technology and innovation were very present, and concretely energy efficient buildings. In the second phase, it changed. Now the established parties focus more on sustainability and the German forest, still on CO2 and economy and labor, as well as energy transition. And here I shortly outlined the main arguments they used in their communication, and I again compare the two times. So while in 2060 till 2018, the established parties focused on responsibility for international climate protection, technology and innovation for climate protection, climate change, that climate change is real and that they miss climate targets. Actually, they also claim, for example, that climate protection is a question of survival in many of their communications. And since 2019, they focused very much more on concretely the German forest as an important economic sector, but also as an element that needs to be protected. And again, one argument relies on technology and innovation in climate policies, but also always on economic issues and jobs. So while in the first phase, here in red again, thinking global and climate protection as an issue for survival were more central topics next to competitiveness and technological solution, of course. Since 2019, the established parties, they changed the focus to national and local aspects. They set a strong focus also on economic issues, and they more address the future in their communication. So I come back to my hypothesis 3 and 4. And I was able to verify the first one, but I still have to analyze and interpret, or to finish to interpret the policies regarding climate change in Germany. This has still to be done. So in conclusion, the RWP's climate skepticism seems to have an impact on climate change communication of established parties. Established parties, however, didn't show climate denial, but the foci and argumentations on climate change discourses, they changed. And based on this analysis, and especially the literature and theoretical frameworks, the RWPs have a fundamental impact on, or are an impact factor for this concrete change. Of course, I still have to finish this investigation and of course to finish the policies in Germany and to outline also the critique, which is an important part of the discourse analysis, and also to investigate fully the mainstreaming concept. And of course, I still need to fully analyze the case of Spain, Austria, and Switzerland as well. So these are some of my references, and now thank you very much. It was really great to be here, and I will look forward to questions and comments and also critique later on.
Okay, so as Jose said, we're studying the case of Vox's amendment to the climate change law and its representation in the press. So our aim is to see if the press reproduces Vox's climate change denialist arguments, since the Spanish press has sometimes had a history of adapting their agenda or their discourse on certain topics following Vox's ideary, or if they're critical towards it. And so for a quick context, we'll explain it properly later, because it's rude to assume that everybody knows what we're talking about. On the 17th of June of last year, 2020, Vox presented an amendment to the then in progress law project on climate change and energetic transition. And this amendment was luckily rejected later on last year. We've taken this case for various motives, but generally we've detected that despite the overwhelming scientific evidence that we all know about, there's still far-right political movements with strong denialist positions all over Europe and generally all over the world. And since there's such a lack of studies on Vox specifically, we're curious to detect the differences between Vox's actions regarding this law project and how the press represented their full amendment. And so we'll quickly go through the introduction and the article framework and a quick explanation of who Vox is too, in case not everybody knows. And so we're starting from the premise that there are linkages between far-right politics and climate change denial, according to various studies. Yet there is not as much state-of-the-art regarding the far right and their environmental communication. Is generally something that's looked over. Vox is the first, got it somewhere, mainstream far-right party to have such an enormous presence in Spanish Parliament since democracy. And in the last elections in 2019, they became the third most voted party. They are define themselves as far-right, Catholic, nationalist, and they're very populist as well. There's a whole pack. They have a strong nationalist discourse of Spaniards first, and they first came into power and their main fixation surrounded the Catalan separatist process and the defense of Spain and Spanish traditions and Spanish traditions. It's becoming a study object in the communication field, especially with topics like the social media and their use of emotions like fear to build their discourse. And although climate change has been an element that Vox has explicitly positioned themselves with, there is no research currently about the stance of this party, so it's a really open field. Here we've got some examples from social media, so you can see what the level's like. And the top image is from one of their higher politicians, Rocío Monasterio, saying that she sees all the progressives under attack. It's hard to explain on the news the alleged links between climate change and the storm Filomena, which was a big storm in Spain this winter, laughing. And then the other declaration that if the planet warms up a little, it will prevent deaths from the cold. So we can see what the standard is. And for this analysis, we're going to explain what the Spanish law project on climate change and energetic transition is. And we've used framing analysis and critical discourse analysis. So the Spanish law on climate change and energy transition was approved recently for Spain to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and it's been the first law approved on climate change in the Spanish Parliament, and obviously Vox voted against it. In this presentation, we analysed their amendment, which was an amendment to the full text and didn't exactly present many options, any alternatives. And as you can see in the left-hand corner, we've already got that typical far-right discourse of Vox against the climate change. We question the dogmas it imposes. That's their own language. That's how they define themselves. And so first we've got the framing analysis, that frames certain interpretation of reality. We've obviously Entman was one of the main authors on this topic. And to do this study, we've taken the list of denialist frames used by Almiron, in one of her papers last year, and we use it to check whether Vox's arguments include these frames in its climate change law project amendment. So we've got the general scientific claims, the specific ones, and the non-scientific claims. And we'll go through them later with the actual analysis. So that's just the introduction. Oh, sorry, that went fast. And we also use for the news articles, we've used critical discourse analysis in order to analyze Spanish news articles that were written before and after, so when the amendment was presented up to a month later, and in order to expose strategies that seem normal on the surface, but seek to shape the representation of, oh, sorry, I'm really bad with these buttons. Anyway, I don't want to go over critical discourse analysis again too much, because the presentation before was just about it, and it was, I have to say, much better than mine. So we'll just go a bit quickly. And we've used the studies of Wodak mainly, and because the categories in each study are not fixed and they're elaborated for each specific problem. So we've tried to find the categories that adapt the best to the text that we've found from the study, allowing us to understand the way the media discourse describes Vox's action. The second one allowing us to tackle the question of representation of social actors. And the third one to cover the construction of how the press represents the Vox's construction of the in-group and the out-group. So to get these texts, we use THINKClima, using the search terms of Vox and climate change law from the 1st of June to the 31st of July, and of which we obtained 149 articles, of which the ones valid for studying were 67. And so when it comes to the results, we've got the types of frames used by Vox in the amendment and the types of press coverage this amendment received. Sorry. And so we've got the identified frames using Almiron structure. The Vox amendment to the climate change law presents almost all the denialist frames. We can see them here on the right, marked in green, 11 out of 14. And its discourse is very similar to those circulating in the climate counter movement in the USA and Europe. And so the red ones are the few ones like B4, B7 and C13 are the frames that don't appear in the amendment. And so we'll go now to some specific examples. So here we've got the examples of the frame and the translations. So I like, for example, Spain must remain committed to the environment, but not at all cost. The second one, it's too long to read, but I think it's amazing, where they compare it to studies in 1890, where they predicted London and Paris would lie under a mountain of dung. And so if that was wrong, then all these studies on climate change must be wrong. Then we have the sensitivity of the left, the sensitivity of the left, the need of the left for state intervention, and obviously they're strongly against state intervention, and then the idea that in the future, as the economy will get better, we'll be capable of fighting climate change in ways we can't even think about right now. And so when it comes to the critical discourse analysis, luckily the reception and coverage from the press has been either neutral or critical. We've not found any articles where they're really applauding Vox's position, which I think is generally positive based on other examples of press representation of the far right in Spain. And so here we've got the clearly no fear in calling Vox's amendment negationist. It's a generally not exactly left-wing newspaper, Mediterráneo. And so it's just quick examples I'm going to try and go through, because that's all we have time for, and that's all that fits in a PowerPoint as well. We have the representation of political discourse and ideology. We have all sorts of media. Generally, most of the articles that we've studied and most of the articles in this presentation are from centrist to right-wing media, because generalist press in Spain doesn't have a very big left-wing left-wing position, and generally it's been hard to see this media call out Vox. So seeing in these articles where they call it, pointing out that they're the far right parties, the use of verbs, and the quotes and the ridiculizations from the left wing, like the quote at the bottom, we found really interesting. And then the way the social actors were portrayed, it's mainly the Vox spokesperson Mirjam Gruber who's been mentioned, but also Vox as the party far right party, Santiago Abascal, who's the leader. That's how they describe it. And I found it very interesting too, the social actors that Vox quoted the most were the Spanish citizens, and mainly farmers, hunters and stock breeders. They were the main Spanish society that needed to be protected in their discourse against this horrible left-wing environmentalist law. And then we have following on this path, we have the in-group and the out-group. And so we've got Vox saying that this law amendment means to blame farmers and blame livestock breeders, who in Vox's discourse can be seen as this traditional Spain, this rural Spain, this untouched Spain, this even anti-European Spain sort of thing, that in a nationalist sense. And so we've got this in-group of Vox of the Spain that can't be touched, the patriots, the farmers, and then we have the others. We have PSOE, who's a party in power, we have the government, and we have the left wing who's pushing this law amendment generally. Okay, so this slide went a bit wrong, sorry, but at the top it says nationalism, traditionalism, and a tad of Euroscepticism. Too much information in one slide. So here we've got some quotes from the news articles regarding Vox's amendment, and it just proves the nationalist discourse that they're able to transmit, and the defense of traditional values, just Spanish traditional values, they're able to transmit even in such a topic as an environmentalist law. So the negative effects on Spanish economy, how it endangers national survival, I think that's an amazing one. How this law will radically transform, obviously not in a good way according to them, a bad way, the Spanish way of life. How these energy lobbies, because they're in favor of nuclear lobbies, I forgot to say that one, they're the ones marking the European agenda. So this is their consideration of we don't want state intervention, we don't want European intervention either. And how they call it repressive, by claiming that it wants to change the economy and the lives of Spanish people. But obviously in their eyes, this is not in a good way. So I think it's really interesting to see how they transmit these ethno-nationalist and even economical protectionist values through arguments regarding climate change. And so generally in the conclusions, we can say that regarding the press, luckily a clear denialist amendment that the Spanish press have rejected, and they've had no fear in calling them by their name and showing that this isn't on the right path and that they do not agree with Vox's positions. And meanwhile, Vox is still replicating these well-worn denialist arguments similar to those circulating throughout Europe and the USA. And I hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope you have some interesting questions, and I'm really sorry about the technical mishaps.